Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for March 28th, 2024. I'm going to do something a little different today by taking a broader view of the strategic crisis from the standpoint that we've now reached a moment of change, but one which requires a higher level of strategic thinking in the population. Forget about the elites, the establishment. They're not capable of escaping the axioms that have driven us to this point of a breakdown of the system. But I'm going to approach this by looking at an article in the March issue of Foreign Policy magazine by columnist Michael Hirsch, titled, "Is This a Revolution or Are People Just Very Ticked Off?" Now, he's trying to make light, in a sense, in the title of what he's writing about, but it's a very important article in that it gives you a sense of both the concern from the establishment as well as their inability to define a way out of the crisis. And we're going to look at it from the standpoint of Lyndon LaRouche, who wasn't trapped in those axioms, but in fact was a revolutionary thinker and provided a method of thinking which can get us out of this crisis today. Now, Hirsch's article is a review of a book by Fareed Zakaria, the CNN commentator. His book is called The Age of Revolutions, and it refers back to Zakaria's article in Foreign Affairs a year ago, which was titled The Self-Doubting Superpower, unquote, in which Zakaria wrote, quote, "The unipolar moment could not last forever. History had to return," unquote. And that's what he tries to do in his book. But as you'll see, his view of history is distorted by the typical problem of those who are influenced by British imperial geopolitics. Now, in his book, Zakaria warns of the failures of what he called illiberal democracy. And he points out that long ago he predicted the, quote, "the rise of the rest" in opposition to the failure of the illiberal system. Now, Zakaria correctly identified a backlash against what he called American arrogance and overconfidence, which grew out of the hubris of the post-Cold War era, which he defines as the triumphalist aftermath of the post-Cold War era. Now, he writes about, for example, the series of wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, that were foolish and were failures. He writes about the extending of NATO eastward to the borders of Russia. He writes about deregulation and free market policies, which were responsible for the breakdown in 2008 and the continuing crisis today as we see the financialization of markets producing valuations and debt which are unsustainable, but without an alternative other than continuing the imperial looting of the system. Now, he makes an interesting point on NATO expansion, because Zakaria said that he believes that the eastward expansion of NATO was a provocation of Putin and was largely responsible for the present proxy war in Ukraine. However, he identifies the overall problem as an attempt to move too fast into a hyper-globalization. And he said that much of the world, the developing sector, lacked the institutions that meant that democratization ultimately failed. And so he essentially is within the Atlantic Council talking points that we're now in a system in which we're faced with a breakdown of democracies and a rise of authoritarian governments. And this is not only an oversimplification, but a justification for the might makes right idea of the so-called rules-based order. But he doesn't identify that. Now, he does point out that for Russia, the privatization of the shock therapy policy led to a looting, and that Putin was a backlash against this, which is true. There was a demographic collapse of Russia as a result of the post-1991-92 shock therapy, which one commentator called more shock, too little therapy. But he then goes on to say that the disruption of traditional societies has led to what he describes as an anti-Western counter-revolution. Again, it's true, but what do you mean by the breakdown of traditions? Well, look at the rise of the countries of Africa. The traditions they're rejecting are the traditions of the imperialism of the last 400 or 500 years. Now, in reviewing the failed policies, there's one glaring omission in Zakaria's view, and that is he ignored the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, or left them out, because LaRouche was constantly presenting what was the real problem of the neo-colonial present and offering an alternative for the future. It was LaRouche who challenged the corrupt oligarchs, and that made him a threat, identified by none other than Henry Kissinger, who was one of the promoters of the Get LaRouche task force, which ultimately threw Lyndon LaRouche in prison to try and suppress his ideas. Now, why was LaRouche such a threat, and why would people like Zakaria ignore his analysis? Well, LaRouche was the one economist who fully understood the shift from the post-war period of Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy and their economic strategic posture, which was based on the ideas of the American system. Both Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy were anti-colonial. They advocated economic development as a way of bringing the less developed countries or the former colonial countries into the modern era. And this included the implementation of great projects, especially infrastructure, and the development of full-set machine tool economies in the developing sector as the way to make up for the unjustness of the post-war or of the pre-war colonial policies, and the need to, in a sense, leapfrog into modern industrial societies instead of remaining mired in peasant agriculture and extraction of raw materials. Now, in his work, LaRouche drafted many programs identifying how the American system of economic development, the Hamiltonian credit policy, the investment in physical economy, that this would be the basis for a peaceful transformation of the less developed countries. His ideas live today in the work that's ongoing with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the BRICS, the emergence of what some are calling a post-dollar or post-petrodollar economy, based on investment in real physical good production and taking power away from the corporate cartels that are living in this new imperial order. Now, LaRouche was precise in his analysis going back to 1971 of what the Nixon break with the Bretton Woods policies represented. Not just that it was an end to the dollar reserve system, but what this implied, a move toward what he described as Schachtian economic austerity, referring to Schacht, who was Hitler's finance minister, who was put into power in Germany by the corporate cartels and the trusts of the United States, and especially the City of London, and that those policies became the dominant policies in the post-war period after the death of Roosevelt and the murder of John F. Kennedy. Now, LaRouche identified this empire as controlled by the financial and corporate interests centered in the City of London and Wall Street. And he was ruthless in his exposure of these fascist policies, that they were committed to a post-industrial world that was part of their embrace of depopulation and their use of war, assassination, and color revolution coups to build their new world order. Now, what Zakaria recognizes in a somewhat distorted way is that this liberal democratic order is disintegrating, and it's disintegrating rapidly. Now, the question is, is there a way out of disorder? And that's where you see the fatal flaw in his analysis. And it's partly pointed out in the review of his book in the Current Foreign Policy magazine by Michael Hirsch, who writes that in his analysis of the last 500 years, Zakaria, quote, decides to mostly ignore the significance of the American Revolution, unquote. That is a huge omission. Instead, he points out that Zakaria embraces the 19th century policy of the British neoliberals, and in their adoption of what he calls enlightened reforms. Now, the contemporary leader that Zakaria identifies as embodying this outlook of the mid-19th century British liberalism is Joe Biden. And in his sense of the need to counter what he describes as the so-called extremism of Donald Trump, Zakaria says Biden is guided by the motto of the mid-19th century British liberals, quote, reform that you may preserve, unquote. Now, besides leaving out the most significant event of the last 500 years with colonial imperialism, that is the American Revolution, Zakaria is embracing the outlook of the British imperialists who preserved an unjust colonial order for another 150 years. And today that order is defended by US and NATO military power. So that's a very significant omission. And it shows what happens when you suppress the ideas of someone such as Lyndon LaRouche. Now, what Zakaria ultimately fails to grasp is that history is not a series of events defined by linear continuity, but by discontinuity. That is, when the injustices perpetrated by an existing order become unbearable to a majority of citizens who are trapped in that system, there must be a break. The break could lead to wars, chaos, famine, plagues, everything that we're seeing today. Or it could be a moment for a rethinking of taking the actual principles that led to the advances of modern society, but strip them of the control by a gang of elite establishment officials and move toward the principles that were embodied in the American Constitution. So we're at a moment today of such discontinuity, where a rupture will occur. It's occurring. It's happening around us. We see the rise of the global South, which is unstoppable, the emergence of a new financial system outside of control of the City of London. This is happening. And as Vladimir Putin said, it's unstoppable. And this is what LaRouche was writing about from the 1970s until the end of the second decade of the 21st century. Now, either we're going to have an awful tragedy inflicted upon humanity, which could include the extinction of the human race, or a return to the principles of statecraft embodied in the Republican Constitution of the United States. And that will depend on what you as citizens do. And so I'm presenting this picture today to encourage you to delve into the ideas of LaRouche and realize that he was suppressed, he was attacked, he was vilified, completely unfairly, by the oligarchs who today are committed to war and austerity to preserve their collapsing system. And not only was LaRouche right in his assessment of what they were doing that was wrong, but he uniquely offered an alternative, which is now shaping the debate internationally. But you don't get to hear about it because the establishment in the West is so committed to suppressing the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche. Don't allow that to happen. Your future depends on reviving this LaRouche tradition of ideas that goes back to the Greek classical period, the golden Renaissance of Europe, the Weimar classical period, the American Revolution, and the best ideas that have lifted humanity out of the muck of primitive backwardness to the potential today to have colonies on Mars and have an end to hunger and disease on Earth. So I'm putting two links in the description section for you to help you grasp this more clearly. One is a beautiful article by Lyndon LaRouche titled In the Garden of Gethsemane, which was written while he was imprisoned, put there by the Bush Department of Justice. And I'm sure you'll find much, it's a short article, but you'll find much in the way of the getting a glimpse at the beautiful soul that Lyndon LaRouche was and remains today. And secondly, a link to the dialogue I had yesterday with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. So do some homework, work on this, help us develop the ideas that will allow mankind to escape what otherwise is a virtually inevitable tragedy for humanity.